Ferdinand Schörner, the last field marshal of the German army, was a general, a militant, and a fervent National Socialist who led several army groups during the final years of World War II. A rigid personality, Ferdinand Schörner was a simple disciplinarian of blind obedience and a devoted servant of Hitler's orders, becoming the German leader's favorite general during the final months of the war. On the other hand, his ferocity and compassion toward his own soldiers have left a dark mark on his reputation. He was known for his brutality in enforcing discipline, even executing soldiers accused of cowardice or desertion. Shortly before the capitulation, in April 1945, he was promoted to Field Marshal and a month later was appointed the last commander-in-chief of all German armies. Ferdinand Schörner was born on June 12, 1892, in Munich, Germany. His father was a police officer. Schörner joined the Bavarian Army in 1911 as a volunteer in the Bavarian Regiment, where he served for a year and graduated with the rank of non-commissioned officer. He then studied philosophy and new languages in Munich before pursuing a career as a teacher. When World War I broke out, Schörner was a sergeant and officer candidate in the Bavarian Regiment. In November 1914, he was promoted to lieutenant. A month later, he was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, on December 22, 1914. He fought with his unit in France, Tyrol, Serbia, and Romania. In the spring of 1915, Schörner arrived with his unit on the Alpine Front in Italy. For his actions at the front, he was awarded the Iron Cross, first class, on January 27, 1917. Schörner and his Bavarian regiment, deployed in Italy, fought in the Battle of Caporetto. As a lieutenant, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite on December 5, 1917, for the successful attack on Mount Madiger during the last Battle of the Isonzo. On July 15, 1918, he was promoted to first lieutenant. With this rank, he returned to fight on the Western Front, where he was wounded again. At the end of World War I, Schörner joined the EP Freikorps and joined the Reichswehr. In 1923, he was assistant to the commander of the Munich military district, and in November, he participated in Hitler's failed coup. After completing his training as a staff officer, he was promoted to captain on July 1, 1926. Schörner, who was fluent in Italian, joined the Italian mountain troops as an interpreter for a time. From 1931, he worked as a tactics instructor at the Dresden Infantry School. The year after Hitler's rise to power, Schörner was promoted to major on August 14, 1934. He was then appointed commander of the 4th Group of the 3rd Department of Foreign Armies. In this position, he was responsible for developing plans for the military alliance with Mussolini's fascist Italy. Years later, Schörner was promoted to lieutenant colonel on March 16, 1937, and 6 months later, he became the commander of the 98th Regiment of the 1st Mountain Division. In charge of this regiment, he participated in the occupation of Austria in March 1938. The following year, 4 days before the start of World War II, Ferdinand Schörner was promoted to colonel on August 27, 1939. On September 1, 1939, the Second World War began with the German invasion of Poland. Schörner and his 98th Regiment, assigned to the 1st Mountain Division, belonged to Army Group South. This division, although initially in reserve, participated in an attack from Slovakia to the southern border of Poland. After this, the advance continued eastward toward Lviv. This city was a key point for the 14th Army's advance. Schörner's 98th Mountain Regiment arrived in Lviv on September 14th and held positions until the arrival of the rest of the division. During this time, It fought fierce battles against Polish troops as they had to maintain the siege of the city. However, following the Soviet advance, the 1st Mountain Division had to withdraw, as Lviv was part of the Soviet part established by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. After the Polish campaign, Schörner's regiment, along with the entire division, was transferred to the Western Front, where it remained in reserve in the Eifel region until May 1940. On May 10, 1940, the German armies began their offensive into France. The 1st Mountain Division, attached to the 12th Army of Army Group A. Schörner, still commanding his 98th Mountain Regiment, advanced toward the Meuse River through Luxembourg and Belgium and crossed the river in the Fiume area. It saw battles at the Icene Canal and later at the Chemin de Dames. In mid-May, the 98th Regiment attacked the town of Soissons, then turned south and crossed the Marne River. By the end of May, Colonel Ferdinand Schörner was withdrawn from the front and sent to Germany to establish the 6th Mountain Division. The division was quickly established by early June, and Schörner became its first commander. Schörner and his 6th Mountain Division were deployed to France beginning June 13, 1940. The division crossed the Rhine River and advanced toward the town of Saint-Denis, then turned south and reached the town of Pontarlier by the end of June. At the end of the French campaign, Schörner's division remained in the town as an occupation force. Finally, Ferdinand Schörner was promoted to Major General on July 18, 1940. The troops of the 6th Mountain Division remained in the French town of Pontarlier until the end of November. In December 1940, the division moved to Poland, where it remained until the spring of 1941. In February 1941, Schörner's division was transferred to Bulgaria for the upcoming offensive in the Balkans. By March, troops of the 6th Mountain Division had arrived in Bulgaria and joined the 18th Mountain Corps of Field Marshal Wilhelm List's German 12th Army. On April 6, 1941, the Balkan campaign began. While Italian and German forces invaded Yugoslavia, further south, a panzer group and the 12th Army invaded northern Greece. From Bulgaria, Schörner's troops advanced directly against the Metaxas line. However, they encountered fierce resistance from the Greeks. Fighting continued for 3 days, resulting in only limited success for the Germans. Meanwhile, the 2nd Panzer Division, using an encircling movement, crossed the border and overcame Greek resistance. By April 9th, the panzer forces finally captured the city of Thessaloniki. The capture of the city forced the Greeks on the Metaxas line to surrender on April 10, 1941. After that date, Italian units and German troops advanced almost unopposed into southern Greece. On April 20, 1941, Major General Ferdinand Schörner was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. This award was earned for his actions as commander of the 6th Mountain Division during the battle on the Metaxas line. Finally, at 8 a.m. on April 27th, Schörner's advanced troops entered Athens after it was declared an open city without firing a shot. That same day, Schörner was appointed commander of the German garrison in Athens. On June 22nd, at the start of Operation Barbarossa, Schörner's troops remained stationary, and along with his division, they remained in Greece until the end of July 1941. The following month, the mountain troops were sent by railcar to their next destination in northern Finland. On August 22nd, the rail transports arrived in Stettin. From there, the mountain troops were to travel by ship to Oslo and then to Trondheim. From there, they were to reach Kirkenes by sea. While the mountain troops were being transported to northern Finland, attacks toward Murmansk continued day and night. These attacks by the Norwegian Mountain Corps under General Edvard Dietl had begun on June 29th and had so far failed to capture the port of Murmansk. Therefore, Hitler sent Schörner's 6th Mountain Division as reinforcements. Finally, in early September, after many delays by Soviet ships, the troops of Schörner's division arrived at Kirkenes. Schörner and his troops were well received at the port and quickly sent to the front line under the command of General Dietl's Norwegian Mountain Corps. Major General Ferdinand Schörner and Mountain Corps General Edvard Dietl were comrades and close acquaintances, having both served in the 1st Mountain Division in 1938. Upon arriving at the front and recognizing the magnitude of the danger, Schörner immediately committed all of his division's forces to the forefront. While the Mountain Corps attempted to advance, the supply situation for Dietl's Mountain Corps deteriorated. Soviet and British naval forces harassed supply shipments along the Norwegian coast, further weakening the Germans. All attempts to continue the offensive were unsuccessful. Finally, by late September, the Norwegian Mountain Corps was ordered to secure the Petsamo area, as a further offensive was ruled out. Both sides dug in. With the onset of winter and the completion of Operation Silberfuchs, General Dietl ordered his subordinates to fortify their positions against a possible Soviet counterattack. For the remainder of the year, the northern Lapland front remained relatively stable. The following year, German forces in Norway and Finland were reorganized. On January 14, 1942, the German command in Finland was separated from the Norwegian army and the Lapland Army was created. Its first commander was General Edvard Dietl. As a result, Schörner relinquished command of the 6th Mountain Division and took over the Norwegian Mountain Corps. The following day, Ferdinand Schörner was promoted to lieutenant general on January 15, 1942. Still under Dietl's command, Schörner remained in Finland, resisting Soviet counterattacks for the following months. Commanding the Norwegian Mountain Corps on May 15, Schörner was promoted to General of Mountain Troops. On June 22, Dietl's Lapland Army was renamed the 20th Mountain Army. And on November 10, 1942, the Norwegian Mountain Corps was renamed the 19th Mountain Army Corps. No further decisive Soviet attacks occurred until the end of the year. For the following year, 1943, the front in the area was filled with trench warfare and defensive battles near Luostari and the Petsamo River. Schörner remained commander of the 19th Mountain Corps until October 23, 1943, when he was recalled to the officer reserve. However, the situation on the Eastern Front was chaotic. Schörner was quickly transferred to Army Group South, and on November 15, 1943, he assumed command of the 40th Panzer Corps. The Soviet offensive continued across the Southern Front, and German forces were retreating across the Dnieper River. Schörner's Panzer Corps was positioned a few kilometers from Zaporizhia. By the end of the month, the Soviets were attempting to advance toward the city of Kryvyi Rih with the goal of encircling the German troops located on the southern stretch of the Dnieper River. By January 1944, Schörner assumed leadership of the three corps holding the Nikopol bridgehead. It was renamed the Schörner Group. With his harsh command methods, he managed to hold the area, thereby covering the withdrawal movements to the outskirts of Nikopol. However, on January 31, 1944, he relinquished command of the corps and transferred to the officer reserve. For his actions in the intense fighting at Nikopol, Schörner was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross on February 2, 1944. Within a few days, Schörner was deployed to Crimea and appointed commander of Army Group A's 17th Army. By the time the Soviet offensive took place, the army had been cut off in Crimea. Hitler forbade a sea evacuation because he believed the Soviets might use the peninsula as a future air base. By the middle of the month, Army Group A was on the verge of destruction. Its commander, Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, was dismissed due to repeated disagreements with Hitler over the conduct of the war at the front. In his place, on March 31st, Ferdinand Schörner was appointed the new commander of Army Group A. A few days later, on April 5th, this army group was renamed Army Group South Ukraine. For the remainder of the month, the isolated troops in the Crimean Peninsula were evacuated, and upon returning to land, the 17th Army was reorganized. Retroactive to May 20th, 1944, Schörner was promoted to Colonel General. By June 1944, Schörner's armies were pushed back to the Bulgarian border. He remained in command of Army Group South Ukraine until July 20th, 1944. Days later, following Operation Bagration, he was appointed commander of Army Group North. Schörner arrived at the Northern Front on July 23, 1944, and was quickly briefed on the difficult situation. The Soviets were advancing relentlessly toward Riga with the goal of isolating Army Group North as a whole. By the end of July, Red Army forces had reached and captured Riga, simultaneously encircling the German 16th and 18th Armies. The Soviets had severed the connection between Army Group North and Army Group Center. German counterattacks were swift, but unsuccessful. By August 16th, the 3rd Panzer Army launched an offensive against the Soviet corridor in Riga. However, they encountered stiff resistance from 10 Soviet divisions. 2 days later, Schörner ordered his trapped forces to launch a joint attack to open the Soviet corridor in Riga. By August 20th, after intense fighting, the Soviets were finally driven out of Riga. By August 27th, the corridor between the 3rd Panzer Army and the 16th Army had been extended to about 20 kilometers wide. However, these forces came under Soviet pressure for days afterward. For these actions, on August 28, 1944, Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner was awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves. With the breakthrough in Riga, all forces of Army Group North withdrew and broke out of the pocket in the following weeks. Battles continued across the sector, and on October 9th, the Soviets reached the Baltic Sea near Memel. Once again, Schörner's armies were cut off and trapped in Courland. Many retreating forces continued to arrive from Estonia. Many of them arrived by ship from the Sorv Peninsula. For the remainder of 1944, Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner continued to command all forces of Army Group North. For his actions during the final months of 1944, as commander of the entire Courland pocket, Schörner was awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. He remained in command of Army Group North until January 16, 1945. The following day, January 17th, he was again appointed commander of Army Group A. Hitler had ordered Schörner to hold Czechoslovakia and the Silesian Industrial Zone under all circumstances. On January 25, 1945, on Hitler's orders, all German forces on the Eastern Front were reorganized. Army Group A was renamed Army Group Center. By now, the war and the Soviets were reaching German soil. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated for the German leaders. It was at this stage of the war that Schörner began to address the most difficult and desperate situations. Schörner always presented himself as a fervent National Socialist in the eyes of his superiors and subordinates. He led his troops with extreme severity and demanded unconditional obedience. As commander of the entire Army Group Center, Schörner began implementing harsh measures. One of the most famous measures taken in February 1945 was that any soldier found behind German lines would be swiftly tried and executed as a traitor. For this reason, raids on the rear by the military police increased. When any man was found out of position without any justification, he was hanged with a sign reading, "I am a traitor." His inhumane attitude was expressed in countless death sentences against Wehrmacht soldiers, as well as in his remark, "A soldier should be more afraid of the rear than the front." In March 1945, Schörner ordered the execution of Major General Hans von Rohr because he had refused to shoot at soldiers fleeing from Soviet tanks. However, the Army's Oberkommando reduced the sentence, and he was sent to prison. Due to all these events, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, was deeply impressed by Schörner's radical measures of fanatical resistance. In his diary of March 12, 1945, Goebbels mentions Schörner and highlights him as one of Germany's best generals. A convinced National Socialist, Schörner is said to have been extremely loyal to Hitler, and that during his final days, Hitler considered him his favorite general. Impressed by Schörner's measures, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on April 5, 1945. Schörner was the last field marshal in the German army to which Hitler rose throughout the war. For the rest of April, Schörner's armies continued fighting on the banks of the Neisse River near the city of Bautzen. After Hitler's death, as stated in his will, he appointed Schörner commander-in-chief of the German army. However, this position remained inconsequential until the final days of the war. With the siege of Berlin, Schörner's troops were isolated on the outskirts of Dresden. The last order Schörner received was from Admiral Dönitz, who was in charge of the new German government. He ordered him to stop the fighting and surrender, as he had agreed with the Allies. Schörner quickly refused, as this would have meant becoming a Soviet prisoner. After refusing to allow his men to retreat and surrender to the Americans on the night of May 8, 1945, Schörner left his command post, abandoned his troops, and deserted. Although he had condemned soldiers who showed signs of weakness to death, to everyone's astonishment, Hitler's favorite field marshal fled to the west to avoid becoming a Soviet prisoner of war. The day after the surrender, on May 9th, he fled in civilian clothes and, with thousands of marks, flew in a Fiesler Storch to an alpine pasture in Austria. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested by American troops, who handed him over to the Soviets. Eventually, Schörner was sent to a prison camp, where he spent 10 years of his 25-year sentence. Upon his release, on January 17, 1955, he was allowed to return to West Germany. However, for years later, he was arrested again and tried for ordering the arbitrary execution of 2 German officers during the war. Found guilty, Schörner returned to prison and was finally released in 1963. He spent the rest of his life living in Munich. During his post-war life, Schörner suffered the scorn of his former comrades, as his trip to Tyrol in Austria and abandonment of his command post was viewed by other high-ranking officers as an act of cowardice. This was to the detriment of his subordinates, who fell prisoner to the Soviets. He was charged with desertion for leaving his command post without proving a justified order from above, aggravated by his escape by giving up his uniform and disguising himself as a civilian. Gottlob Herbert Biedermann, a German officer of the 132nd Infantry Division who served under Schörner in 1945, reported in his memoirs that both officers and men despised Schörner because he was so extraordinarily brutal. Ferdinand Schörner eventually died in Munich on July 2, 1973. His remains were buried in the Mittenwald Cemetery in southern Bavaria.